My arrogant supervisor fired me and laughed when I warned him the new turbine was vibrating out of spec. He said engineers don't take orders from mechanics. So, I packed my tools, called a federal auditor who owed me his life, and set a flawless trap. 48 hours later, the multi-million-dollar machine tore itself apart, and I made sure he took the absolute hardest fall. At exactly 6:15 a.m., the concrete floor of the lower generator hall at the Apex Hydro project was already humming against the soles of my steel-toed boots. I am Maria Pierce, and for the last 15 years, I have listened to the heartbeat of machines. As the lead bearing specialist, I didn't rely on clean, theoretical computer models. I relied on the raw, physical reality of heavy metal in motion. That morning, the air smelled heavily of ozone, damp river water, and synthetic industrial grease. We were 48 hours away from the final commissioning of Turbine 4, a massive, multi-million-dollar behemoth designed to power half the county. But as I placed my gloved hand against the primary housing unit, something felt wrong. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, a micro-stutter rattling through the 2-inch thick steel casing. "Lucy, hand me the diagnostic analyzer," I called out over the dull roar of the water rushing through the penstocks below us. Lucy Knight, my loyal junior technician, hurried over. She was a sharp kid, barely 22, but she respected the machinery. She handed me the heavy yellow tablet. I connected the sensor leads to the primary thrust bearing housing and watched the digital readout graph spike. The baseline amplitude was supposed to be a smooth, steady wave. Instead, the screen displayed jagged, aggressive peaks. We were hitting 0.45 inches per second on the vibration velocity scale. The acceptable limit for a machine this size was 0.15. "Are we out of alignment?" Lucy asked, her voice tight with concern as she peered over my shoulder. "It's worse than an alignment issue," I muttered, wiping a smudge of grease from the screen to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. "It's a foundational harmonic resonance. The bearing isn't just vibrating, it's fighting the structural housing. If they bring this turbine up to maximum load, the friction will generate enough heat to melt the Babbitt metal right off the pads." I took a step back, looking up at the towering 3-story structure. The sheer physical consequence of a failure here wouldn't just be a broken machine. It would be a catastrophic shower of shrapnel and boiling oil. "We need to halt the ramp-up tests," I said firmly, saving the data logs to my secure drive and disconnecting the cables. "If this thing spins at full capacity, the lateral force will tear the housing apart." "Mr. Peters is going to be furious," Lucy warned, shrinking back slightly. "He's banking on the early completion bonus. He said the computer models cleared the structure yesterday." I gritted my teeth at the mention of Henry Peters. He was our lead structural engineer, a man who wore suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage and treated the turbine floor like an inconvenient dirt pit. He trusted algorithms, I trusted physics. "His computer models don't have to stand next to this thing when it explodes," I replied, my voice hard and resolute. "Print these charts. I am taking this directly to his office." The steel steps clanged beneath my boots as I climbed, my mind racing through the calculations. Every decimal point on that screen was a warning. The machine was screaming for help, and I was the only one fluent in its language. I just had to make Henry Peters listen, even if I had to force the data down his throat. At 7:30 a.m., I pushed open the heavy glass door to the engineering suite. The contrast between the sweltering, noisy turbine floor and Henry Peters' office was jarring. The air conditioning was cranked so high it felt like a meat locker, and the air smelled sharply of expensive peppermint cologne and freshly brewed espresso. Henry Peters sat behind a massive, polished mahogany desk, his eyes glued to 3 glowing monitors. He didn't even look up as I walked in. He was a man who exuded arrogant wealth, tapping his designer pen against the desk in an impatient rhythm. "I'm busy, Maria," he dismissed, waving a hand vaguely in my direction without taking his eyes off a complex 3D rendering of Turbine 4. "If it's about the overtime requisition forms, leave them with my secretary." "It's not about overtime, Henry," I said, dropping the thick stack of printed vibration charts right in the center of his pristine desk. The loud smack of paper against wood finally made him flinch. "It's about the primary thrust bearing on turbine 4. We have a severe harmonic resonance issue. The vibration velocity is spiking at 0.45. Henry slowly lowered his pen. He looked at the charts like they were covered in toxic sludge, then let out a long, patronizing sigh. "Maria, we went over this during the briefing. The structural integrity has been modeled and stress-tested in the software. The turbine is perfectly balanced. The software doesn't account for the microfractures in the concrete mounting pad," I countered, leaning over the desk so he had to look me in the eye. I was just down there. I felt the tremor through the steel. "I have the certified data right here. If we push this machine to full load for the commissioning test on Friday, it will fail catastrophically." Henry let out a short, mocking laugh. He picked up my charts with 2 fingers, barely glancing at the data, before tossing them into his outgoing tray. "You felt a tremor. What, are you a bearing specialist or a mystic? The computer models are flawless. They guarantee a safe ramp-up, and they guarantee my early completion timeline." "Your timeline is going to get someone killed on the floor," I fired back, my patience snapping. "I hold the only level 3 vibration analysis certification in this entire facility. You cannot ignore this data." Henry finally stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, towering over me with a look of absolute disdain. His eyes were cold and unyielding. "Let me make something abundantly clear to you, Maria," he said, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "I have a master's degree from an Ivy League university. You have a collection of wrenches and dirty fingernails. Bearing specialists don't question structural engineers. You do not analyze, you lubricate. Do you understand the difference?" My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. The sheer disrespect radiated off him like heat from a failing engine. "Physics doesn't care about your degree, Henry. The machine is going to fail. The only thing failing here is your ability to follow the chain of command," he snapped, pointing a manicured finger toward the door. "Get back to the floor and do your job. If you delay my commissioning test by even 1 hour, I will personally see to it that you never work in this industry again." By 3:00 p.m. that afternoon, the heavy, humid air of the plant felt suffocating. I had spent the last several hours locking down the maintenance tags on Turbine 4, refusing to sign off on the safety clearance for the Friday ramp-up. I knew the protocol, and I knew the law. I would not put my signature on a death trap. I was halfway through wiping down my calipers when the plant's HR director, accompanied by 2 security guards, walked onto the floor. "Maria Pierce," the HR director said, his voice tight and formal. He handed me a single piece of stiff, cream-colored paper. "Your employment at Apex Hydro Project is terminated, effective immediately. Mr. Peters has cited gross insubordination and willful obstruction of the project timeline." I stared at the termination notice. The paper felt unnaturally smooth against my grease-stained fingers. I wasn't surprised, but the sheer speed of Henry's retaliation was staggering. He was so desperate to secure his $500,000 completion bonus that he was willing to blindly bulldoze the only person trying to save the multi-million-dollar project. Lucy walked over, her face pale as she saw the security guards. "Maria, what's going on?" "I'm being escorted out, Lucy," I said, my voice eerily calm. I began tossing my specialized micrometers and sensors into my heavy canvas tool bag. The metallic clank of my tools hitting the bottom of the bag echoed loudly in the cavernous room. "Make sure you stay clear of Turbine 4 on Friday. Do not stand near the housing when he runs the test. Promise me." "I promise," she whispered, looking terrified. I zipped my bag shut. It weighed a good 40 pounds, a tangible weight of 15 years of expertise being casually discarded. I slung it over my shoulder and followed the guards toward the exit. As we approached the administrative wing, Henry Peters was standing by the glass double doors, holding a cup of espresso and wearing a smug, victorious smirk. He looked like a king watching a peasant being banished from his kingdom. "I told you not to question my models, Maria," he taunted softly as I walked past him. "Leave the thinking to the professionals. We'll be running the turbine at 100% capacity on Friday morning. Without you. I stopped right in front of him. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I just looked at him with the cold, dead certainty of a woman who knew exactly how physics worked. When a thrust bearing fails at 300 RPMs, Henry, the lateral vibration doesn't just damage the machine, I said quietly, locking eyes with him. It shatters the mounting bolts. Then it shatters the concrete. 48 hours from now, your pristine computer model is going to tear itself to pieces. And when it does, there won't be a single piece of paper with my signature on it. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but his arrogance quickly smothered his doubt. "Get her out of here," he snapped at the guards. I walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind me. As I walked to my truck, my hands weren't shaking with sadness. They were perfectly steady. Henry thought he had buried me, but he had just handed me the shovel. It was time to make a phone call. At 4:15 p.m., my truck tires crunched against the gravel driveway of my home. The silence of the rural suburbs was deafening compared to the relentless, bone-rattling hum of the Apex Hydro project. I sat in the cab for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't crying. I was calculating the massive physical forces currently at play inside that facility. Walking through the front door, the scent of roasting chicken and garlic filled the warm air. My husband, Victor, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He took one look at my face and the heavy tool bag slung over my shoulder, and his welcoming smile vanished instantly. "They fired me, Vic," I said, dropping the 40-pound canvas bag onto the hardwood floor with a heavy, final thud. Henry Peters escorted me out. He is running Turbine 4 on Friday at maximum load, and he completely ignored my structural vibration data. Victor didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He walked over, pulled me into a tight, grounding hug, and simply asked, "Who are we calling?" "Sully," I replied, pulling away and reaching into my pocket for my cell phone. David Sully. Sullivan was a retired heavy machinery auditor and a former federal safety inspector. 10 years ago, we were inspecting a high-pressure pump chamber at a massive hydro dam out west. I had spotted a microscopic, spiderweb hairline fracture on a primary valve casing just seconds before a massive pressure test. I yanked Sully back by his safety harness right before the valve blew, sending a lethal jet of highly pressurized water exactly where his head had been. He always told me he owed me a life debt. Today, I was collecting it. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff, gravelly voice answered. "Maria Pierce, to what do I owe the pleasure? Did you find another cracked valve with those eagle eyes of yours?" "Something exactly like that, Sully," I said, pacing the length of my living room. "I need your clearance, and I need your regulatory access. I just got fired from the Apex project by Henry Peters. He is pushing a catastrophic ramp-up test on Friday to secure a $500,000 early completion bonus. The thrust bearing is experiencing severe harmonic resonance. It is peaking at 0.45 velocity. If he spins it up, the lateral force will shatter the concrete mounting pad and tear the housing apart." The line went dead silent. Sully knew exactly what those numbers meant, a velocity of 0.45 wasn't just a malfunction, it was a mechanical death sentence for a machine of that immense size. He ignored a certified level 3 vibration analyst. Sully asked, his tone shifting from friendly to dangerously sharp. "Did you physically log the data into the system?" I saved it to the local servers before he locked me out, and I dropped the hard copies right on his expensive mahogany desk, I confirmed. He claimed his theoretical computer models overrode my physical, real-world readings. I could hear the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard on Sully's end. "Peters is a fool who trusts pixels more than forged steel," Sully growled. "You sit tight, Maria. Let me rattle some digital cages. If he is rushing a federal hydro project for a cash bonus, there is a paper trail. I will find it." Hanging up the phone, I looked out the window. The trap was officially set. Thursday morning dawned with a heavy, oppressive overcast that mirrored the knot in my stomach. At 9, 4:00 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table, staring blankly at a cold cup of black coffee. The ticking of the wall clock sounded exactly like a countdown. We were exactly 24 hours away from Henry Peters initiating the commissioning sequence on Turbine 4. The sheer physical reality of the hydro dam haunted my thoughts. The Apex facility held back millions of gallons of river water behind a curved wall of heavily reinforced concrete. The turbines were the vital heart of that beast, transforming raw, terrifying water pressure into electrical current. If Henry compromised the structural integrity of the lower generator hall, the ensuing chain reaction wouldn't just destroy the turbine. The intense friction would boil the synthetic oil, causing a pressurized explosion of shrapnel that could compromise the secondary bulkheads. I texted Lucy Knight, my loyal former apprentice, making sure she was safe. Stay in the upper glass control room tomorrow. Do not go down to the concrete floor under any circumstances. Promise me. Her reply came back 3 minutes later. Mr. Peters is screaming at everyone. He is bypassing the secondary safety checks to make the Friday morning deadline. I will stay upstairs. I am really scared, Maria. I gripped my phone tightly. Henry was blindly sprinting toward a cliff, dragging an entire team of innocent technicians with him. The arrogance required to override a physical safety warning was staggering, but his greed was driving the machine now. He lived in a world of theoretical numbers, completely detached from the tangible, violent consequences of failing steel. By 2:00 p.m., the waiting became absolutely intolerable. I went out to my garage, the comforting smell of motor oil and cut pine grounding my frayed nerves. I started organizing my spare tools, the familiar, heavy weight of forged steel calming my mind. A torque wrench doesn't lie. A micrometer doesn't lie. Only people do. I meticulously cleaned my equipment, mentally preparing for the fallout that was destined to arrive by tomorrow morning. At 4:30 p.m., my phone finally buzzed violently against the wooden workbench. It was Sully. "Tell me you found the smoking gun," I answered, wiping a smudge of dark grease from my thumb with a rag. "I found more than a smoking gun, Maria. I found the whole armory." Sully's voice crackled through the speaker, heavy with disbelief and barely contained rage. "I called in a major favor with a contact at the Department of Energy. They have backdoor oversight access to the Apex project's mainframes. I have spent the last 6 hours digging through Henry Peters' structural engineering logs." And, I pressed, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Did he alter the computer models to force the software to pass the final stress test? "Worse," Sully replied grimly, the sound of rustling papers echoing over the line. "Much worse. I need you to understand exactly what kind of ruthless snake you are dealing with. Henry didn't just ignore your physical vibration data. He didn't just toss your charts in the trash to be arrogant. He actively engaged in a massive, federal-level cover-up to secure his money." The cold reality of his words washed over me. What exactly did he do, Sully? "He deleted the truth," Sully said, "and I have the digital fingerprints." At 11:45 p.m. on Thursday night, the glow of my laptop illuminated my dark living room. Sully had sent over a securely encrypted file containing the results of his shadow audit. Outside, the rain lashed violently against the windows, a fitting soundtrack for the storm of federal fraud I was currently reading on my screen. "Walk me through this, Sully," I said quietly into my headset, staring at lines of heavily redacted server code that dictated the fate of the dam. "Look at the timestamp on document 4, Sully instructed, his voice echoing with the absolute precision of a seasoned investigator. "At 8:15 a.m. yesterday, exactly 45 minutes after you dropped those physical vibration charts on his mahogany desk, Henry Peters logged into the centralized Apex safety server using his executive administrator credentials." I scrolled down, my eyes widening as I read the digital command prompts. He accessed the localized sensor logs from Turbine 4. "Exactly," Sully confirmed. "Your diagnostic tablet automatically uploaded the 0:45 vibration velocity readings to the mainframe. Those high readings automatically triggered a red flag safety hold on the Friday commissioning test. If that red flag stayed in the system, the Department of Energy would mandate a mandatory 2-week mechanical review, and Henry would forfeit his $500,000 early completion bonus. My stomach twisted with profound disgust, so he deleted the safety hold. He didn't just delete the hold, Maria, Sully growled. He overwrote the raw, physical data. He took your terrifying 0.45 velocity readings and manually manipulated the server logs to show a perfectly safe 0.12 baseline. He forged the structural integrity report. It is textbook federal fraud, and he left a massive, glaring digital footprint on the Shadow server. Mr. Duncan, the plant director, has no idea his lead engineer is feeding him fabricated numbers. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. Henry actually believed his high-level password made him invincible. He thought because I wore steel-toed boots and got grease on my hands, I wouldn't have the intelligence or the high-level connections to uncover his white-collar crime. He had built his entire career on the dangerous assumption that the people below him were blind. "Can we stop the test tomorrow?" I asked, gripping the edge of my desk, thinking of the immense physical destruction that awaited. "Can we shut down the grid before he turns the key?" "No," Sully said, his tone chillingly calm and strategic. "If we report it right now, he will claim it was a software glitch and drag the investigation out for years with expensive corporate lawyers. He will escape accountability. If you want to completely dismantle his career, the Department of Energy needs to catch him in the act. We have to let him initiate the commissioning test. We have to let the machine prove him wrong." I closed my eyes, visualizing the massive steel turbine, the incredible physical forces preparing to tear it apart, and the flawless trap we were setting. "We let the machine fail," I whispered, the gravity of the decision settling in my bones. "At 8:00 a.m. tomorrow, the trap springs," Sully promised. "Get some sleep, Maria. Tomorrow, the concrete crumbles." Friday morning at 7:00 a.m., the air in the river valley was bitterly cold, biting at my cheeks as I stood on the public scenic overlook a full mile above the Apex Hydro project. I had a heavy thermos of black coffee in one hand and a pair of military-grade binoculars resting against my chest. My truck was idling softly behind me, the heater fighting the damp chill. On the hood, my laptop was tethered to a cellular hotspot, displaying the public energy grid output for the county. At 7:45 a.m., my phone buzzed in my heavy coat pocket. It was a text from Lucy Knight. "I am locked in the upper glass control room. Everyone is cleared from the lower floor. Mr. Duncan is here. Henry Peters just authorized the penstock gates to open. He looks so smug. My hands are shaking, Maria." "Keep your eyes on the exit, Lucy," I typed back, my thumbs stiff from the freezing cold. "Do not look away from the structural pillars." At exactly 8:00 a.m., a low, guttural vibration rolled up the valley walls. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a physical pressure that vibrated deep within your chest cavity. The massive steel gates deep underwater were opening, allowing millions of gallons of pressurized river water to violently slam into the enormous blades of Turbine 4. Through my binoculars, the concrete face of the dam looked completely serene. But I knew the chaotic, destructive physics violently fighting inside that lower generator hall. On my laptop screen, the digital megawatt output began to climb slowly. 10% capacity, 20%. At 8:15 a.m., the grid showed the turbine crossing the 50% threshold. This was the exact point where the harmonic resonance would begin to actively fight the heavy steel housing. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of impending disaster in the crisp air. Suddenly, the radio scanner sitting on my dashboard crackled to life, tuned directly to the plant's internal emergency frequency. "We have a heat spike on the primary thrust bearing." A technician's voice barked over the static, sounding incredibly frantic. "Temperature is exceeding 200 degrees and climbing fast. We are registering severe lateral movement on the housing." "Ignore it," Henry Peters' voice snapped back over the radio channel, dripping with arrogant authority. The computer model predicted a minor thermal adjustment during the initial ramp-up. It is just the Babbitt metal seating itself. Push it to 80% capacity. Now. Sir, the physical housing is visibly shaking. I said push it. Henry screamed. At 8:22 a.m., I lowered my binoculars. Even from a mile away, the dull, rhythmic hum of the hydro dam suddenly changed pitch. It shifted from a smooth, powerful roar to a jagged, agonizing mechanical screech. It sounded exactly like a massive freight train grinding its iron wheels against a solid concrete wall. Then, the very earth beneath my boots trembled violently. A sharp, explosive crack echoed out of the valley, loud enough to scatter a flock of crows from the nearby pine trees. The first heavy mounting bolt had just sheared perfectly in half under the immense pressure. The fracture had officially begun. I looked back at my laptop screen. The megawatt output graph, which had been climbing in a smooth arc, suddenly stuttered. The digital line flatlined, then spiked wildly before dropping into a chaotic, jagged pattern. The energy grid was actively rejecting the unstable current. Henry Peters had blindly trusted his pixels, but the physical world was currently collecting its devastating toll. At 8:24 a.m., the radio scanner on my dashboard erupted into a wall of pure, panicked static. Overlapping voices shouted frantically over the open frequency, completely abandoning any sense of professional decorum or protocol. Sheared bolts on Sector 4. The concrete is cracking. A voice screamed, completely distorted by the deafening mechanical roar echoing in the background. Drop the gates. Drop the penstock gates immediately. Mr. Duncan, the plant director, was roaring into the microphone. His voice lacked any of its usual polished corporate calm. He sounded genuinely terrified for his life. Down in the valley, a thick, rolling plume of black, acrid smoke began to violently vent from the lower exhaust stacks of the Apex Hydro project. The foul smell of vaporized synthetic oil drifted up the ridge, a sharp, chemical warning that reached my nose a few moments later. The thrust bearing hadn't just failed. The intense friction had superheated the lubrication reservoirs, boiling the oil instantly. Through my binoculars, I could see the heavy emergency blast doors on the exterior of the generator hall automatically slamming shut, a mechanical failsafe designed specifically to contain high-velocity shrapnel. Inside that hall, I knew exactly what was happening. At 300 revolutions per minute, the unbalanced, multi-ton turbine shaft was whipping violently against its steel restraints. The immense lateral force was mercilessly pounding the concrete mounting pad to dust. Every single structural warning I had printed on those paper charts was currently manifesting into a violent, kinetic nightmare. At 8:27 a.m., the ultimate failure finally occurred. A massive, thunderous boom physically shook the windows of my parked truck. Even a mile away, I felt the sudden shift in air pressure. The heavy steel casing of turbine 4 finally ruptured. I imagined the jagged chunks of shattered metal ricocheting off the reinforced concrete walls, tearing through secondary piping, and violently ripping the expensive, pristine machinery to absolute shreds. The laptop screen on my hood instantly flashed red. The grid output from the Apex facility dropped to absolute zero. The massive safety breakers had forcefully tripped, plunging the entire lower facility into an automatic, grid-saving emergency lockdown. My phone vibrated aggressively. It was Lucy. It exploded. The whole floor shook like an earthquake. The glass in the control room cracked. Mr. Duncan is screaming at Henry. Henry looks completely pale. He is just staring at his computer monitors in dead silence. I let out a long, slow breath, the white vapor pluming softly in the cold morning air. I closed my laptop carefully, feeling the cold aluminum casing against my fingertips. Nobody was hurt. That was the only thing that truly mattered. I had ensured the floor was cleared. But the multi-million-dollar turbine was completely destroyed, and the project timeline was permanently shattered. Henry Peters had forcefully pushed the button, driven by his arrogant greed and his absolute refusal to listen to the people who worked with their hands. He had built his entire career on the illusion of control, and in exactly 48 hours, The uncompromising laws of physics had violently dismantled it. I packed up my gear. Now, the desperate scramble for survival would begin. I knew exactly what Henry would do next. He would look directly at me. By 1:00 p.m. that afternoon, my living room felt like a strategic war room. I was sitting at the dining table, nursing my third cup of coffee, while Victor sat across from me, quietly reading a book but keeping a supportive, watchful eye on my demeanor. The intense adrenaline of the morning had faded, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating focus. My phone rang at exactly 1:15 p.m. The caller ID prominently displayed the main administrative number for the Apex Hydro project. I let it ring twice, taking a deep breath to completely steady my pulse before pressing accept. "Maria Pierce speaking," I answered, my tone perfectly neutral and completely unbothered by the morning's chaos. "Maria, this is HR Director Evans." The voice on the other end was stiff, formal, and tightly wound with stress. "You are hereby formally requested to attend an emergency investigatory meeting at the plant headquarters at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Mr. Duncan and our corporate legal counsel will be present." Am I still terminated? I asked calmly, tracing the intricate grain of the wooden table with my fingernail. "Your employment status remains permanently terminated," Evans confirmed quickly. "However, as the former lead bearing specialist, you are required to answer questions regarding the catastrophic failure of turbine for this morning. Mr. Peters has submitted a preliminary incident report naming your specific maintenance department as the primary cause of the mechanical fault." I almost laughed out loud. The sheer, predictable audacity of the man was astounding. "I will be there at exactly 3 o'clock, Mr. Evans," I replied and hung up the phone. I immediately dialed Sully's secure line. He answered on the very first ring. "They summoned me," I told him, looking over at Victor, who had closed his book and was now listening intently. "Henry is actively initiating the scapegoat protocol. He filed a preliminary report blaming my team for the explosion." "Of course he did," Sully chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that promised absolute professional ruin. "He is trapped in a corner, and he thinks he can lie his way out. He is going to claim you improperly calibrated the vibration sensors. He is banking on the fact that he deleted your original warnings from the server. He thinks it is his pristine word as a lead engineer against a fired mechanic." "Are the Department of Energy investigators in place?" I asked, walking over to the coat closet to grab my professional leather jacket. "They are already in the building, Maria," Sully confirmed, the heavy sound of a steel door closing echoing in his background. "They arrived in unmarked vehicles 20 minutes ago. They are waiting patiently in the adjoining conference room. When Henry presents his fabricated logs to Mr. Duncan, he is committing federal perjury. We let him dig his grave on the official record, and then we push him in." "I am leaving now," I said, a profound sense of justice settling over my shoulders like heavy armor. "Give him enough rope, Maria," Sully advised softly over the line. "Let him talk. Let him act arrogant. And when he thinks he has completely won, you signal me, and I will walk through those doors with the shadow audit." I grabbed my keys off the counter. The tremor in the turbine was over. It was time for the shockwave. At exactly 2:55 p.m., I walked into the sprawling, glass-walled conference room at the Apex Hydro Project headquarters. The air conditioning was freezing, heavily chilling the room, and the air smelled sharply of dry erase markers, polished wood, and anxious perspiration. Mr. Duncan, the plant director, sat heavily at the head of the long mahogany table, looking 10 years older than he had yesterday. His expensive silk tie was loosened, and his face was drawn and pale. To his right sat two sharply dressed corporate lawyers, their laptops open, their expressions completely unreadable. And then there was Henry Peters. He sat comfortably to Mr. Duncan's left, wearing a perfectly pressed navy suit, completely unbothered by the catastrophic destruction that had occurred just hours ago. He looked up as I confidently took my seat across from him, offering me a tight, condescending smile. He actually believed he had already won. "Let's get this over with," Mr. Duncan began, his voice raspy and profoundly exhausted. At 8:27 this morning, Turbine 4 suffered a total structural failure. The initial damage estimates exceed $14 million, not including the severe operational delays. Henry, you submitted an emergency incident report citing gross negligence by the maintenance team. That is correct, sir, Henry said, his voice smooth and incredibly confident. He slid a thick, glossy folder across the polished table. The computer models for the turbine housing were absolutely flawless. I reviewed the localized sensor logs just before the test. The baseline vibration velocity was reading at a perfectly safe 0, 12 inches per second. However, upon reviewing the post-incident mechanical debris, it is clear the primary thrust bearing was improperly lubricated and incorrectly calibrated by the lead bearing specialist, Maria Pierce. He turned his cold, arrogant eyes toward me. She willfully ignored standard calibration protocols because she held a personal grudge against the engineering department. Her negligence caused the harmonic resonance that tore the machine apart. I have the digital server logs right here to formally prove the initial readings were safe. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the cold table. The sheer audacity of his lie was almost impressive. He was aggressively perjuring himself in front of corporate counsel without batting an eye. Maria, do you have any response to this? Mr. Duncan asked, looking at me with a mixture of professional pity and severe anger. Did you falsify the calibration on that bearing? I looked at the heavy clock on the wall. It was exactly 3:12 p.m. Mr. Duncan, I did not improperly calibrate the bearing. I recorded a severe harmonic resonance of 0, 45 velocity yesterday morning. I brought the physical charts to Mr. Peters, and he fired me for it. Henry laughed loudly, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed unpleasantly off the glass walls. That is an absolute fabrication to cover your incompetence. The server logs don't lie, Maria. The data clearly shows a 0:12 reading. You have absolutely no proof of your supposed warnings. I don't need proof, Henry, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, dead tone. I reached into my coat pocket and pressed the send button on a pre-drafted text message. Because the Department of Energy has it. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open with a loud, authoritative click. David Sullivan walked in, wearing a sharp gray suit, flanked by two grim-faced federal investigators wearing golden badges on their belts. The trap was finally sprung, and the look of absolute shock that washed over Henry's arrogant face was worth its weight in gold. He froze completely, his confident, wealthy smile vanishing into thin air. What is the meaning of this? Mr. Duncan demanded, standing up abruptly. The corporate lawyers immediately went rigid, their eyes darting nervously to the federal badges entering the room. Mr. Duncan, my name is David Sullivan. I am a retired federal safety inspector acting as a contracted consultant for the Department of Energy, Sully said, his gravelly voice commanding the absolute attention of the entire room. He walked straight to the table and dropped a massive, heavy stack of watermarked documents directly on top of Henry's pristine incident report. We are here executing an emergency federal oversight warrant regarding the catastrophic mechanical failure of Turbine 4. Henry's face rapidly drained of all color. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. You don't have jurisdiction here, he stammered defensively, his polished corporate demeanor completely shattering. This is a private internal corporate investigation. It became a federal fraud investigation at 8:15 yesterday morning. Sully corrected him sharply, pulling out a specific document highlighted in bright yellow ink. He turned to Mr. Duncan, who was watching in stunned, breathless silence. Sir, your lead structural engineer did not just ignore physical safety warnings. He actively committed cyber fraud to secure his $500,000 early completion bonus. He accessed the centralized safety server and manually deleted Maria Pierce's localized sensor logs. The entire room immediately fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The ticking of the wall clock sounded exactly like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. That is a lie. Henry shouted desperately, standing up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed loudly to the floor behind him. Those logs are secure. Nobody can alter them without triggering an internal automated audit. Which is exactly why we pulled the data from the Shadow server, Sully countered, his eyes locking onto Henry with the terrifying intensity of an apex predator. You thought your executive administrator password made you a god, Peters. You intentionally overwrote the devastating 0.45 vibration velocity readings and forged a perfectly safe 0.12 baseline. We have your IP address, your terminal login, and the exact keystroke timestamps. You pushed a machine you knew was failing to a critical breaking point just to line your own pockets. And then you tried to frame an innocent woman to cover your tracks. Mr. Duncan slowly turned his head to look at Henry. The plant director's face was completely devoid of any sympathy. "Henry," he whispered softly, his voice shaking with absolute, uncontainable fury. "Is this true? Did you alter the structural safety logs?" Henry opened his mouth, but no words came out. His arrogant wealth, his Ivy League degree, his expensive custom-tailored suit, none of it could protect him from the cold, hard, physical evidence sitting heavily on that mahogany table. He had built his entire career on an illusion of superiority, and Sully had just aggressively shattered it into a million unrecoverable pieces. Henry Peters, one of the federal investigators, stepped forward, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "You are being formally detained pending federal charges of criminal negligence, cyber fraud, and reckless endangerment of a federal utility grid. Please step away from the table." As the investigator reached for his heavy steel handcuffs, Henry finally looked at me. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't the king of the engineering suite anymore. He was just a broken man facing a decade in federal prison. At 6:30 p.m., exactly 1 week after the catastrophic explosion that violently rocked the Apex Hydro project, I was sitting quietly on my back porch. The evening air was wonderfully warm, completely different from the biting, bitter cold of that fateful Friday morning. A sweating glass pitcher of sweet iced tea rested on the small, wrought iron table beside my rocking chair, and the soft, rhythmic chirping of summer crickets filled the peaceful suburban twilight. Victor was inside the house, happily humming a tune while cooking dinner, the rich, comforting smell of roasted garlic wafting through the open screen door. The news had officially broken publicly 2 days ago. Henry Peters was formally indicted on multiple federal fraud charges by the Department of Energy. The government immediately seized his extensive assets, aggressively freezing his accounts and completely liquidating the massive early completion bonus he had so desperately tried to steal. His prestigious engineering license was permanently and publicly revoked. He would never work in the utility industry again, and the energy corporation's highly paid lawyers had completely abandoned him to gracefully save the company's stock price. Mr. Duncan had called me to personally apologize, offering my lead-bearing specialist job back with a substantial raise, but I politely declined. I was taking a lucrative, independent consulting position alongside Sully. Furthermore, Lucy Knight called me yesterday to proudly tell me she was promoted to a senior technician role, finally safe from toxic management. As I sat there, watching the bright sun slowly dip below the tree line, painting the wide sky in vibrant shades of burnt orange and deep purple, I felt a profound, heavy sense of peace settle over my shoulders. The multi-million-dollar machine had been completely broken, but the truth had survived perfectly intact.